I want to get some additional perspective. David mentioned Chrystia Freeland. She is the Deputy Prime Minister and has been now since the election, but she's also now the Finance Minister. One person who knows what it's like to occupy both those roles at the same time is John Manley. He joins us now. I think that you're somewhere in the province, are you not?
I'm in the beautiful township of Rideau Lakes.
Oh, excellent. Well, thank you very much for making time, carving some time out of your day to join us, Mr. Manley. Pleasure as always to see you. Let me start off and ask you about the resignation of Bill Morneaus. We were just talking about it with my colleagues, Rob and David. I know you were listening to the Prime Minister's comments. Were you surprised by Minister Morneaus, or Mr. Morneaus, I should say, resignation?
Well, surprised that it came to this at this point in time. We're in the midst of a very difficult period in the Canadian and global economy. We don't really know when the end of this will be. We know roughly that we've got to get some control over the pandemic before the economy can recover. We've got sky-high deficits, all committed on the watch of this finance minister. It's a very odd time for him to bail.
Do you think it was about those policy differences as reported over the last week and a half, or something more?
Well, I can only believe. This has been reflected in a lot of the commentary, including some of that we just heard. One of the key jobs of the finance minister is to say no. And you say no to a lot of people, to caucus, to interest groups, to the opposition. But especially important, you have to say no to the Prime Minister from time to time. And given the circumstances, you have to believe that Mr. Morneaus' no was not accepted, and that that's left him with no choice but to either go or go along. And I think he must have decided not to go along.
Let me ask you, Mr. Manley, based on your own experience, what that relationship between the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister is like or can be like?
Well, it's vitally important. You've got to have the head of the government on side with your financial plan. I mean, the preparation of the budget, for example, takes many, many months of very hard work, consultation all around by the finance minister. But there isn't a budget until the magic words come out of the Prime Minister's mouth, we have a budget. Because you just can't be on different pages. And I was there, of course, I inherited the finance portfolio from Paul Martin, but even when they were really at odds, they were at odds over who should be Prime Minister. But when it came to the financial decisions, the fiscal framework, programming decisions, there wasn't a crack of light to be seen between the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance. It's vitally important. Because otherwise, your government is chaotic.
And what about when you assume the role of Deputy Prime Minister? You're in the unique position that you can offer us some perspective that few others could about what Chrystia Freeland is up against right now.
Oh, it's the best place to be because as Minister of Finance, you're being briefed and provided information by the Department of Finance. As Deputy Prime Minister, you're in the Privy Council office, and you're being briefed as well by the Privy Council office. And when it was me, both sides, in terms of the bureaucracy, were a little bit uncomfortable with that because they were never quite sure. Because there's always tension there. They're never quite sure which side you're going to land on. So it's a great advantage because you've got the challenge function from Privy Council office against finance all coming at you directly. You don't have to wonder where somebody else is going to come from. You know the Privy Council office briefs the Prime Minister. So it's a very desirable position. Now, the challenges that I had, I also chaired all of the cabinet committees simultaneously and held on to a few other disconnected roles that were pretty tricky to unload, including responsibility for a number of Crown corporations. I think Ms. Freeland is not burdened with some of those things, so she can focus on the finance responsibility.
And what do you think of the selection of Ms. Freeland for those roles?
Well, I think she has emerged in the Trudeau government as being the strongest minister, the one who has an identity of her own. And partly that came through her performance around the NAFTA negotiation. Before that, on the CETA negotiation, the European Trade Agreement, which she almost single-handedly delivered to the Prime Minister. So I think she's shown strength. She's shown political savvy, maybe to a degree that Bill Morneaus never was able to do. But she has not been in a largely economic portfolio, nor has she been known to be somebody that spoke on economic themes. So she's going to have to work hard. She's going to have to earn her chops on some of those other areas.
It's clear, and understandably so, that the economy will be at the forefront of whatever agenda ends up being presented when Parliament resumes towards the end of September. I want to ask you about what you might anticipate from that vision in a second. But first, on the subject of prorogation, what do you think of that move? We have the opposition standing by. I'm sure they're not going to be thrilled with the idea of shutting everything down. What do you think about it?
You know what, the opposition, of course, this is a target, and they remember well how it actually became something Canadians talked about when Stephen Harper used it back in during the last major global economic crisis. But, you know, Vashi, you and I can talk about it, but outside the bubble in Ottawa, prorogation, is that something they do in baseball? I don't know. This is not going to be that salient to Canadians. I mean, if he suspended Parliament till 2021, that could be a problem. But coming back next month, Canadians are going to grasp the last vestiges of summer between now and then. They may clean their barbecues, but they're not going to be worrying about politics. They're going to worry about COVID and about what the next steps are, whether their kids can go back to school. They're not watching Parliament, I have to say.
We shall see. We'll get the take from the opposition in a moment. But I do want to ask you finally, before I let you go, Mr. Manley, about what you might anticipate from the government. They did provide some indications of what kind of an agenda, an economic agenda, we will see when Parliament resumes. They did say they'd put it to essentially a vote of confidence through the throne speech. Based on what you heard, what do you anticipate and what would you like to see in that agenda?
Well, I don't know that I put a lot of stock into just the words and phrases. I mean, they let's face it, when they go to Parliament, they have to maintain their government by appealing to the NDP and the Bloc Québécois. So this is an election campaign where you really need the center. This is a parliamentary situation where you need the support of parties that are more to the left. And so the rhetoric and even the speech from the throne will undoubtedly reflect that. The problem that they will face is that the basic rules of how your economy functions haven't changed. You need private investment, and you need to give confidence to investors that you are going to have a firm hand on the levers of fiscal policy, that you're not going to let things run out of control, that you're going to protect the currency, and they're going to have to understand what drives business decisions, which is not something that is instinctive to Ms. Freeland. It was to Bill Morneaus, and he had confidence from broadly from the business community. She's going to have to earn that. And what the government says is one thing. What it does is it is going to have to satisfy the concerns of the investors and the business community, because otherwise you're never going to see the recovery that the governing party needs in order to be reelected when the time comes and when that center actually opens up to others.
Okay, I'll leave it there. I'm out of time, but thank you very much for your time. As always, Mr. Manley, pleasure to have you back on the program.
My pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Former Deputy Prime Minister John Manley.
In the coming weeks, we will present our plan to rebuild a stronger, more resilient Canada. This will be our roadmap out of the pandemic towards a society that is fairer and more welcoming, towards communities that are better prepared for future crises, and towards a country where everyone is safer and healthier. As our first step to make this plan a reality, we will present a speech from the throne on Wednesday, September 23rd. This is the same week that the House of Commons was already scheduled to return. The throne speech will give us the opportunity to lay out in detail our approach going forward. It will also allow Parliament to hold a confidence vote on this new plan. Today, I have asked the Governor-General to prorogue Parliament, which must happen before any government can present a throne speech.
So that was the big news from the Prime Minister's remarks today. From prorogation to the Finance Minister's resignation last night, there is so much to discuss with our next panel. We've reached some former top Liberal insiders who are, of course, no strangers to tensions between Prime Ministers and Finance Ministers. I know that we've got Peter Donolo somewhere, but our connection is a bit wavy. It's waving a bit right now. So he's the former Director of Communications to Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. As soon as we reach him, we'll bring him up. We've also got, though, Michelle Cadario. She's the former Deputy Chief of Staff to former Prime Minister Paul Martin. She's now principal of the J&M Leadership Network over in Dryden, Ontario tonight. Hi, Michelle. And David Hurley was a former advisor to Paul Martin, also the Liberal campaign chair for the 2004 and 2006 elections. He's now partner in the Gandalf Group and host of the wonderful Hurley Burley podcast. He's over in Quebec. Hi to both of you, and hopefully Peter soon. Let's start off with, if you guys don't mind, we'll move to prorogation and what the Prime Minister announced in a moment. But I do, since we were talking all last night about Bill Morneaus, want to get both of your takes on, given your former roles and what you've experienced, what you think went down in the lead up to that resignation. Michelle, I'll start with you. What do you think happened there for real?
Well, I think that, there's always that tension, and everyone talks about it, between the Finance Minister's office and the Prime Minister's office. And that was very true in our day, and it's true in successive governments. But what you need to have, though, is a common goal at the end. And if that kind of parts or confidence is in any way lost, then there has to be a change made. And the role of the Finance Minister is so important that you can't have someone there that you don't share that grand vision with, and that you don't have the same goals. You'll fight along the way. But the minute that the sniping kind of seemed to start between the two offices in public, something had to happen, and a big resolution had to happen. Either them coming out arm in arm or there being a break. And it turns out that there was a break.
David, I thought it was interesting today when the Prime Minister was answering questions. He went over, his long list of why he really liked and worked well with Bill Morneaus. And then the follow-up question was, well, when he told you he was resigning, did you ask him to stay? And the Prime Minister did not reply in the affirmative.
Right. Well, there's a famous story that when John Turner went to offer his resignation to Pierre Trudeau, really expecting to be hugged and told that he was the heir apparent and maybe he could get out of the difficult finance job and move into foreign affairs, that Pierre Trudeau asked him if he wanted to be a senator or a judge. Did not ask him to stay. So maybe there's a family trait here.
Perhaps.
But I don't think he asked him to stay because I think he wanted him to leave. And I think that that's been evident for some time now. I certainly noticed that the Prime Minister and his office's support of Mr. Morneaus during the hearings was pretty weak, and in fact there was some distance gone to create some space between them on the we issue, and then there was the stories about Mark Carney, which are bound to imply some lack of confidence in your current economic direction and thinking. And then lastly there was that very pointed story in the Globe and Mail with a bunch of sources is saying, here are all the things that the Prime Minister is unhappy with about the Finance Minister. And then the Finance Minister waited sort of 3 or 4 days, it feels like to me, to get a sense of whether that really reflected the thinking in the Prime Minister's office. And I guess he gathered that it did, because he fired a few salvos back on his own. And then they had this meeting last night. And I'm sure by the time the meeting happened, Mr. Morneaus was ready to go. But I think it was precipitated by the fact that the Prime Minister wanted him to go.
So shortly thereafter, after the resignation, Michelle, we get the news that Chrystia Freeland is the new finance minister. She assumes the role in addition to being deputy prime minister. Dominic LeBlanc takes over in intergovernmental affairs. Let's start with Minister Freeland and that selection. What do you think the thinking is there?
Well, first, I just want to say it's about time that we have a woman as Canada's finance minister. And I know I, for one, would have been extremely disappointed if that wasn't the choice. She's the most able and capable minister in the government, and she's going to take on the most serious role in government and the most difficult role. So I think that she was a lock for that position, and I think that she'll do a great job. The Prime Minister clearly has confidence in her as his deputy prime minister. They've been working hand in hand, and she's had a good relationship with all of the provinces. And so much, I think, going forward is going to be about those relationships with the provinces, and re-looking at the transfer payments and some of the supports in different areas that have clearly shown their weakness as we've gone through this pandemic.
David, we had John Manley on earlier, and he was talking about that it is important for a finance minister to be able to say no in certain respects to the Prime Minister. And Chrystia Freeland was asked by our reporter about any disagreements that she'd had, or times, I think it was Tonda McCharles from the Star, about any time she had said no to the Prime Minister. And she referenced a conversation she said that they both had yesterday around that, but said that she wouldn't publicly catalog those differences. I wonder what your sense of the relationship is, and if you think, and what you think of that answer.
Well, I'm sure that Mr. Chrystia was petrified of John Manley's steely gaze in the days when he was finance minister. Tough one. In any event, I think that I'm anticipating that they're going to have a great relationship, and it's not going to be so much a matter of saying no. I don't think this would have happened had some conversations not been occurring about direction. Probably in her capacity as Deputy Prime Minister, they've been discussing where the government needs to go. We desperately need an economic plan in the country and a plan to move people off of CERB, et cetera, and continue to provide people the support they need. That thinking needs to happen and needs to be happening. And so I presume that they have already decided that they're on common ground. But let's also not forget that Chrystia Freeland, partly through her book Plutocrats and partly with her early work with Team Trudeau, is really the intellectual inspiration for the middle class and those working hard to join it theme of this government. And so nobody's better suited in this circumstance to try to renew that theme and put new life into it in this circumstance. I mean, I think that, frankly, she's the intellectual driver of this government.
Michelle, on the subject of, I guess, how that informs what she and the Prime Minister present in concert with the rest of Cabinet and the rest of their party on September 23rd, when Parliament resumes. They have prorogued Parliament, essentially shut it down until then. We got some signals today about what we might expect. What sorts of things are you looking towards? And do you think prorogation politically might backfire on them?
No, I don't. Quite frankly, I expect that they would prorogue. It is the traditional restart, but a new speech from the throne isn't that unusual, especially when you think about the last speech from the throne and the circumstances that it was given. It was pre-pandemic. The world has changed so drastically, and Canada has changed so drastically. So, of course, they need to come up with a new direction that will then be brought out in the budget. I really want to see, we talk about the She Session, and it's true. Women have really been hurt hard and continue to be hurt hard in terms of the economic situation, the jobs that have been lost. and the struggle right now to see if women can go back to work because so many are actually having to take care of their kids. You know, the provinces are now starting up with an experiment in terms of opening schools. What we've seen from down south hasn't been all that encouraging, and though we won't take lessons from them, you know, it is a bit worrisome for people with children. Can they safely go back to school? And if they can't, what's the impact of that on the economy? And there's some really big thinking and some fundamental choices that need to be made on a go-forward basis to make the economy actually fair and to be able to bring women back in and to do so in this kind of an environment. So she's got a huge job ahead of her, and I think that she's really capable of it.
David, the opposition was on just a few moments ago, essentially making the argument that, fine, if that's what you need some time to do, go for it, but why can't you also keep Parliament open? Why can't committees also continue to study the WE controversy? And the NDP's essential point was, by shutting down Parliament right now, you don't allow for the legislative mechanisms that might need to be in place in order to transition people who are kind of running out of CERB over the next few weeks. How do you think the prorogation, the shutdown for the next few weeks plays out?
Well, I don't know the details of governance, but I do think that managing the transition off of CERB is got to be both the number one public policy priority, but also the number one political priority. I think this is fraught with enormous difficulty for the government because there isn't, the EI program is not able to support all the people that were being supported by CERB. There's going to have to be some different system, and that needs to happen right away because people's CERB checks are ending. And so this could turn the government's pandemic honeymoon south in a big hurry if they mess this up. So I don't know what the impacts of prorogation are, but I do think that is job one. In terms of the rest of it, you know, I don't think that people understand, and they're not going to be sympathetic, but I'm just going to say it. I don't think people understand how distracting something like these WE committee hearings are to the central agencies of government. And I'm not dismissing its importance, but I personally attach more importance to having a renewed plan for the economy and for our society going forward. And I will not begrudge the Prime Minister, the Minister of Finance, and other senior ministers, because I hope this is a whole of government effort, from taking the time to produce a really robust plan in the fall.
Yeah, I guess the proof will be in the pudding when we see that plan. I'm going to press pause on the panel and on the show for a few minutes so we can take a quick commercial break, but we'll be back with more Power and Politics and more special coverage of today's cabinet shuffle here in Ottawa in just 2 minutes. Stay with us. Welcome back to an extended edition of Power and Politics and special coverage here on CBC News Network of today's cabinet shuffle here in Ottawa. To recap very quickly for you, last night, Finance Minister, now former Finance Minister, Bill Morneaus resigned at about 7 o'clock Eastern. This morning, we found out that Chrystia Freeland would assume his responsibilities in that portfolio and add to her own as Deputy Prime Minister. She then shifts some responsibility for the Intergovernmental Affairs portfolio to Dominic LeBlanc, who is scheduled to be on our program in just a few minutes' time. Lots of reaction to those decisions, as well as the resignation of Morneaus from the opposition today. And in addition, more reaction from the opposition and members of the government, or members of the Liberal Party, I should say, as well, to the decision by the Prime Minister to prorogue, essentially shut down Parliament until September 23rd, when Parliament was supposed to resume originally. He will deliver a speech from the throne. The government will deliver a speech from the throne and face a confidence vote, as he outlined. Here's a little bit of reaction from the opposition and members of the government to that.
Today, I have asked the Governor-General to prorogue Parliament. Chrystia Freeland is now Canada's Minister of Finance. Dominic LeBlanc is the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. We have a choice to make. We can decide to move forward instead of returning to the status quo. In the coming weeks, we will present our plan to rebuild a stronger, more resilient Canada. As our first step to make this plan a reality, we will present a speech from the throne on Wednesday, September 23rd. It will also allow Parliament to hold a confidence vote on this new plan.
So I think that was just the Prime Minister. I didn't. So we will wait for some more reaction. We did have the opposition on the program, but we've got some other reaction to that coming up. I want to bring in now our panel, Michelle Cadario and David Hurley, who were with us a bit earlier. And we have finally reached successfully, I'm very happy to say, Peter Donolo. He, of course, is a former director of communications to former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. Hey, Peter, great to see you.
Hi there.
That's okay. No worries. You know what? It happens almost on a daily basis to us. I'll get to David and Michelle in a second, but because we're just getting to you now, I do want to bring you in. Your reaction to what we heard from the Prime Minister today.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I'm still kind of reeling from yesterday, which was a very unorthodox way to shift gears for a government. The transition out of Mr. Morneaus was very bizarre yesterday. But putting that aside, listen, I think the fact that he's entitled to bring in a new throne speech. The government is not waiting forever to do this, or not waiting. It's not like the Harper examples where they prorogue the House for months on end. This is coming back exactly when it would have. Obviously, he's played up a politically astute card by gumming up the committee workings a little bit in the WE inquiry. But listen, I think that's actually a pretty adept step. If there's bad stuff there with WE, you can bob and weave for a while, but you can't duck it forever. So if there's bad stuff, it'll come out. But that said, I think in terms of a new agenda, if that's what if that's what this is really about, then I don't see a big deal with the way he did it. It's probably the right call.
Do you think that's what it's really about? And when you say that yesterday was unorthodox, what do you mean?
Listen, I felt, ever since last week that Mr. Morneaus was treated in a disgraceful manner by, anonymous leaks from the Prime Minister's office, undermining a sitting finance minister, something that to me is appalling. Certainly, you had David and Michelle on. I don't know what you talked about while I was in technical difficulties. But that's not the way we operated. I worked with these guys when Paul Martin was a Minister of Finance and Jean Chrétien was a Prime Minister, and for certainly the longest time, things got a little, I guess, testier at the end when Mr. Martin wanted Mr. Chrétien's job. But seriously, for the really tough years of tough slogging to turn this country around, these guys who are not BFFs by any measure, work together for the good of the country. And I think Prime Minister needs to support a finance minister. I tell people the difference between Paul Martin and Michael Wilson is that, that Jean Chrétien was with the program, whereas Brian Mulroney, dropped the program and didn't back up as minister. So it's super important. I thought it was kind of shabby treatment the other day. If this had all been about Mark Carney coming in, as we've been reading in the papers, then that might have been interesting. Mark Carney would have been, no question, a big step up for the government, trading up, in a sense, an international figure, a global influence. But that's not what it was about, it turns out. So I think it was kind of shabby. You notice nobody mentioned the OECD today at the news conference. So I don't know what's happening there. You don't launch a campaign for the OECD, a few weeks before the closing date, that's for sure. I
think the Prime Minister referred to it as Bill Morneaus' next steps, but you're right, he didn't name the OECD there. David, do you think the way that Peter's characterizing the differences between how it unfolded with Paul Martin and Jean Chrétien as different than what just went down with Bill Morneaus, do you think that's a fair characterization?
Well, I think that Peter's right. I mean, for many years, up until the point at which most Liberals and Paul Martin decided that the party needed a new, more vigorous policy agenda at the end of a lengthy term of Mr. Chrétien's rule. Up until that point, I think things worked pretty well. But it wasn't just the two. It wasn't just the two of them. It was a whole system that was working together to make it work. So there was a lot of interaction between the finance officials and people in the Prime Minister's office and people in the PCO. There was a lot of interaction between Mr. Chrétien's personal staff and Mr. Martin's personal staff. A lot of energy was put into ensuring that when Mr. Martin and Mr. Chrétien met, it was a successful meeting. Because all that spade work had been done in advance. I don't get the impression that this system worked particularly in the same way. I also don't think that Mr. Morneaus ever had the same independence, and certainly this is a point that Peter made that I'll reinforce very strongly. I don't think that Mr. Morneaus was allowed to become a different center of power in the government than the PMO itself. I don't think he was allowed to have that stature that would allow him to sort of carve out the unique role in scoping policy that other finance ministers have had. But the way the last week rolled out, that's never been done to anybody. That not in the worst days of the Chrystia Martin affair was that kind of stuff. There was some occasional sniping that went beyond the bounds, and usually people were slapped right back into place after those things.
Michelle, do you? Yep. Sorry, go ahead, Peter, right? And then I'll grab Michelle.
This is not a game. We're a G7 country, and we're in the midst of an economic crisis. So you don't play games, against Shadowbox your Minister of Finance. If there was a problem, and I thought, one thing you asked me about the PM's performance today, I thought he was all right by and large. I thought that he was kind of like these non-answers about his relationship with Morneaus or platitudes about the relationship with Morneaus, I think, are actually sort of insulting. But my point is that, like, political game playing when the country's in such an economic bind, I think is a mistake, and it's detrimental to the country. Now, that said, I do think if the government wants to turn a page to a more activist, stance, although I think they've been quite activist up to now, that's another matter, and they're entirely entitled to do that. I think there's other issues that relate that relate to that, which is, for example, I believe that Liberal governments should be moderate governments and should have a dynamic representation at the table of all sectors of society, including the business sector. And I worry that if we tilt too far in one direction, then we don't have that moderation and that equilibrium that I think Canadians really prize.
Michelle, Minister LeBlanc is standing by for me to head over and grab an interview with him, so I want to give the final word to you. David raised an interesting point in the degree of independence that Minister Morneaus was or was not granted by the Prime Minister. Do you think that will change with Minister Freeland?
I think that's up to Minister Freeland. I think that, if she takes on the role and goes out there and really does dive into and develop that economic agenda that we need, that Canada is desperate for, if she goes out and seeks expert advice and draws them in, as Finance Minister Martin did, then she has the opportunity to do it. I think that she's going to have to, make her case, and she has a good relationship with the PMO, then she has the opportunity. But nobody's going to hand that to her. She's going to have to take that on herself, and she's going to have, and she has to take her stature and use it. And so I wish her well.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you, all three of you. Great pleasure to have you with me all together tonight. Thanks to Michelle Cadario, Peter Donolo, and David Hurley. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.